February 1945, a cave on Iwo Jima. 20 meters beneath volcanic rock, a 53-year-old Japanese general sat writing to his wife by the light of a single oil lamp. His hand was steady. His words were not the words of a man preparing for glory. They were the words of a man preparing to die. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He had studied in the United States in the late 1920s. He had ridden with the U.S. cavalry at Fort Bliss, Texas. He had eaten dinner with American officers. He had learned their language. He had watched their factories. He had driven across their vast open country. He knew things about the United States that most Japanese commanders refused to believe. Years before the war, he had written a sentence that he would repeat to his family more than once. A sentence that the militarists in Tokyo did not want to hear. The United States is the last country in the world Japan should fight. He had said more. He had said that America's industrial potential was huge and fabulous and beyond imagining. He had said the American people were energetic, versatile, that one must never underestimate their fighting ability. Now, in a cave on a black volcanic island, he wrote his final letters. And somewhere far above him on the radio, Tokyo was still telling Japanese soldiers that the Americans were cowards. He knew it was a lie. 2 years earlier, another Japanese officer had believed exactly what the radio told him. His name was Kiyonao Ichiki. He led 917 of Japan's finest soldiers against a line of United States Marines on an island called Guadalcanal. He was certain the Americans would break. 6 hours later, 800 of his men were dead. This is the story of how that certainty was born. How it spread through the highest levels of the Japanese military. And how, on a jungle island in the South Pacific, it began to die. To understand what happened on Guadalcanal, you have to understand what Japanese commanders believed before the first shot was fired. And to understand that belief, you have to go back further than the war, further than the century. You have to go back to the mountains and the myths. For more than 1,000 years, Japanese culture had carried a story about itself. The story was written in ancient texts called the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. It said that the Japanese people were not like other peoples. They were descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. Their emperor was not a king. He was a living god, a direct connection to the heavens. By the early 20th century, this ancient story had hardened into military doctrine. The Japanese called it Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. It meant that Japanese soldiers possessed something no other army possessed, a spiritual force, a willingness to die that no Western enemy could match. Machines could be built, weapons could be manufactured, but spirit could not be bought. And spirit, the Japanese believed, was what won wars. Then came proof. In 1905, a small Asian nation went to war with the largest empire in Europe. Russia had more soldiers, Russia had more industry, Russia had modern rifles and modern artillery, Japan had spirit. When the fighting ended, Russian armies had been shattered, Russian fleets had been sunk. The Tsar's proud empire had been humiliated by an enemy the world had dismissed. For Japanese military planners, the lesson was written in blood. Steel had lost, spirit had won. By the 1930s, this lesson had become an unshakable law. Japanese officers were taught it in the academy. Japanese soldiers absorbed it in basic training. And when they looked across the Pacific at the United States, they saw exactly what their doctrine told them they would see. They saw a soft country. A country of tall buildings and long automobiles. A country of jazz music and Hollywood movies. A country whose young men had grown up with electric refrigerators and radios. Where Japanese boys learned to endure hunger and cold, American boys, they were told, learned to expect comfort. Where Japanese soldiers welcomed death, American soldiers, they were told, would run from it. This was not a rumor. This was official Imperial Japanese Army policy. Then the war began, and for 6 months, the doctrine appeared to be correct. In December 1941, Japanese forces struck the American Philippines. The defenses were supposed to hold for 6 months. They collapsed in weeks. On the Bataan Peninsula, on the fortress island of Corregidor, tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers surrendered in the largest capitulation in American military history. General Douglas MacArthur escaped by torpedo boat, leaving his army behind. In Malaya, General Tomoyuki Yamashita drove his forces down the peninsula with terrifying speed. When he reached the great British fortress of Singapore, he found more than 80,000 Allied defenders waiting behind concrete and steel. Yamashita's force was less than half that size. He attacked anyway. 6 days later, the British surrendered. Winston Churchill would call it the worst disaster in British military history. Hong Kong fell, the Dutch East Indies fell, Burma fell. The pattern was always the same. Japanese soldiers advanced with fanatical determination. Western defenders held for a while, then broke. Colonial garrisons that had ruled Asia for generations dissolved like sugar in the rain. At a tiny coral atoll called Wake Island, a small force of United States Marines held out for more than 2 weeks against overwhelming odds before finally surrendering. Japanese commanders noted the resistance, filed it away, and drew no lessons from it. Wake was an accident. Wake was an anomaly. The Marines there had simply been trapped with nowhere to run. By the summer of 1942, Japanese planners had a simple picture of the enemy they faced. The Americans had better equipment. They had bigger ships, they had more supplies. But they lacked the one thing that mattered in war. They lacked the will to fight. This belief extended with particular contempt to one specific American force, the United States Marine Corps. Japanese intelligence had studied the Marines carefully, and they had found nothing that impressed them. The Corps was small. Fewer than 70,000 men at the start of the war. It was, in the eyes of Imperial General Headquarters, barely a branch of the American military. It had spent the years between the world wars fighting small colonial actions in Nicaragua and Haiti, chasing bandits and rebels through Central American jungles. It had faced no serious enemy since the trenches of France in 1918. To Japanese planners, the Marines were something between garrison troops and colonial police. Men who played at being soldiers. Men who had never met a real army in the field. What Japanese intelligence missed was almost invisible, because it had happened quietly, in classrooms and training grounds, over more than a decade. Through the 1930s, a group of Marine officers had been studying a problem no one else in the world was seriously studying. How do you attack a defended beach? How do you land men and equipment across a hostile shore into the guns of an entrenched enemy and win? They wrote manuals, they built new landing craft, they developed doctrines for close air support, for naval gunfire, for the coordination of ships and infantry. They built a force designed for exactly the war that was coming. More than that, they built a culture that said the youngest corporal on the beach might be the one who had to make the decision. A culture that trained sergeants to lead when officers were down. A culture where the plan was a starting point. Not a scripture. The Japanese knew none of this. And what they did not know was about to kill them by the thousands. The man who would carry the Marines into that war was not a young man. Alexander Vandegrift was 55 years old in the summer of 1942. He was a major general, a Virginian, a career officer who had spent his entire adult life in the Corps. He had chased rebels in Nicaragua. He had served in Haiti. He had walked the streets of Peking. He had the quiet, weathered look of a man who had seen many small wars and expected to see one more. He had been promised 6 months to train the 1st Marine Division before it saw combat. He got 3 weeks. The order came down in the summer of 1942. American planners had learned that the Japanese were building an airfield on an island most Americans had never heard of. An island in the Solomons chain called Guadalcanal. If that airfield became operational, Japanese bombers could threaten the sea lanes to Australia. The airfield had to be taken, and it had to be taken now. Vandegrift's division was scattered across the Pacific. Equipment was still being unloaded in New Zealand crates. His men were a mixture of hard-eyed veterans and raw recruits. Many of them boys who had walked into recruiting stations the week after Pearl Harbor with rage in their hearts and no idea what jungle warfare meant. There was time for one rehearsal landing on the Fiji Islands. It was, Vandegrift himself said afterward, a complete disaster. Boats missed their beaches. Equipment went into the wrong holds. One senior logistics officer, reviewing the plans, later said that any experienced planner would have declared the operation impossible. On August 7, 1942, they went in anyway, 11,000 United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal and the smaller islands of Tulagi and Florida. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. The construction workers on the airfield, most of them Korean laborers with a small guard detachment, dropped their tools and fled into the jungle when American warships opened fire. By nightfall on August 8, the Marines held the unfinished airstrip. It would be named Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had been killed at the Battle of Midway 2 months before. The landing had been almost easy. Everything after it would be a nightmare. The nightmare began that same night. In the dark waters north of Guadalcanal, a Japanese naval force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa slipped past the Allied warships guarding the transports. What followed was one of the worst defeats in the history of the United States Navy. In less than an hour, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sunk. More than 1,000 sailors died in the burning oil and the black water. The Battle of Savo Island ended before most Americans in the fleet even understood it had begun. At dawn, the surviving Allied commander, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, made a decision. His aircraft carriers were exposed. His screening force was gone. He could not risk more losses. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. The transports went with him. And on those transports were the food, the ammunition, the medicine, the heavy equipment that the Marines on Guadalcanal had not yet unloaded. Vandegrift's men watched the ships sail away. They were alone. They had a captured airfield. They had rifles and what ammunition they carried on their bodies. They had captured Japanese rice, which would become their primary food. They had a jungle full of malarial mosquitoes, dysentery, and the certainty that Japanese forces were already moving to take back what they had lost. Half a world away, in Tokyo, the response to the American landing was quick and confident. The Marines had captured an airfield. The Marines would be pushed back into the sea. The man chosen to push them was a colonel of infantry named Kiyonao Ichiki. He was 49 years old, a hard officer with a hard reputation. He had been at the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937 at the incident that had begun Japan's long war in China. He was, in the eyes of his superiors, exactly the kind of aggressive commander who could crush a garrison of American Marines in a single stroke. His regiment had originally been trained to assault Midway Island. When the naval battle there had ended that plan, they had been redirected to Guadalcanal. They were among the best troops Japan had, and they were being sent against, in the assessment of Imperial General Headquarters, an enemy who would not stand and fight. Ichiki was told to wait on the beaches until the rest of his regiment arrived. Slower transport ships were bringing his second echelon. He should wait a few days, gather his full strength, and then attack. He would not wait. He landed at Teivu Point on the night of August 19, 1942, with 917 men. He looked at the jungle in front of him. He looked at the reports that said perhaps 2,000 Americans were dug in around the airfield. He believed his doctrine. He believed his emperor. He believed that Japanese spirit would sweep the soft Americans into the sea. He gave the order to march. At 6:15 on the morning of August 21, he would be standing at the edge of a coconut grove, staring across a shallow creek at a line of American Marines. He had no idea what was waiting for him there. He had no idea that the war he thought he was fighting was about to end, and that another war, a war Japan could not win, was about to begin. It would begin with a machine gun at a river's mouth. It would begin with an old scout who refused to die. And it would begin in 6 hours on a strip of sand no one had ever heard of. The jungle at night on Guadalcanal was not silent. It breathed. Insects screamed in the trees. Something large moved through the undergrowth and then stopped. The air was thick as warm water, heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation and the salt of the sea. Men who had grown up on Iowa farms and Brooklyn streets crouched in shallow holes and listened to a world that did not belong to them. On the far side of a shallow tidal lagoon called Alligator Creek, which the American maps had mislabeled as the Tanaru River, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was preparing to attack. He had marched his men fast. He had marched them without full rest. He had marched them with a confidence that came from years of doctrine and a lifetime of belief. Somewhere on the marine side of that creek, he was certain there were fewer than 2,000 Americans, soft men, materialistic men. Men who would run when they saw the bayonets coming. He did not know that 11,000 United States Marines were waiting on the other side. He did not know something else. He did not know about a man named Jacob Vuza. Jacob C. Vuza was around 50 years old that August. He was a Solomon Islander, a former sergeant major in the British Solomon Islands police force. When the war came, he had put on a new uniform in his heart, if not on his body. He served as a coast watcher, a scout, one of the men who moved through the jungle carrying information that could keep the Marines alive. A Japanese patrol caught him. They searched him. They found, hidden inside his loincloth, a small American flag. What happened next was not a battle. It was slower than that. And it was more terrible. They tied him to a tree. They took a bayonet and they used him for practice. They stabbed him in the arms. They stabbed him in the throat. They stabbed him in the shoulder, in the face, in the chest, in the stomach. 7 wounds. They left him for dead. He was not dead. When the Japanese moved on toward the American lines, Vuza began, slowly and with terrible patience, to chew through the ropes that held him. He tore skin, he tore muscle, he spat blood into the dirt, and when the ropes were gone, he began to crawl. He crawled for miles through jungle that would have killed a healthy man. He crawled with 7 bayonet wounds and a throat that no longer worked properly. He crawled toward the Marine perimeter because he had information, and the information was more important than his life. He reached the American lines only minutes before Ichiki's assault began. He gasped out his warning to a Marine officer. Then he collapsed. Jacob Vuza would survive. He would receive the Silver Star from the United States. He would be made an honorary sergeant major in the United States Marine Corps. He would live to be nearly 92 years old. He would die in 1984 in the same islands where he had crawled through the jungle to save American Marines. And the men whose lives he saved that night would never forget his name. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on August 21, 1942, the first wave of Ichiki's soldiers charged across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek. Their bayonets caught the moonlight. Their voices rose in a single sound, banzai. This was how it had always worked. This was how Singapore had fallen. This was how the Philippines had collapsed. This was the moment when Western soldiers broke. The Marines did not break. Along the creek, in positions that had been dug and rehearsed and re-rehearsed, water-cooled Browning machine guns opened fire. The .30 caliber rounds moved across the sandbar in interlocking arcs. The first wave of Japanese soldiers did not reach the American lines. They did not reach halfway. They fell where they ran, in clumps, in rows, the men behind stumbling over the men in front. The sandbar became something that was no longer a sandbar. It became a floor of bodies. American artillery had been registered on the approaches before the sun had gone down. When the observers called for fire, the shells came exactly where they had been asked to come. The accuracy of that fire would astonish every Japanese officer who lived to write about it. Every path, every clearing, every route of advance had been measured. There was no direction Ichiki's men could go that had not already been calculated. Some of them still made it to the Marine positions, and there in the dark the fighting became something the doctrine had not described. Rifles, bayonets, pistols, hands. Marines fought Japanese soldiers with entrenching tools and rifle butts. They gave ground. Then they took it back. They did not run. At one machine gun position, a young Marine named Al Schmid was operating his weapon when a grenade exploded near his face. The shrapnel took both of his eyes. He was blind. He was in shock. He was in a foxhole in the middle of the largest fight of his life. He kept firing. His assistant gunner wounded himself, called out the direction of the enemy. Left, right, center. Schmid moved the gun where he was told to move it. He fired at sounds. He fired until dawn came, and he could not see the dawn. That was one man in one hole, on one night. There were thousands of them along that line. When the sun came up, Vandegrift did not stop. He ordered a counterattack. Marines from the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, crossed the creek upstream. They swung around behind Ichiki's surviving men and closed the circle. Light tanks joined them, M3 Stuarts that the Marines called their Iron Cavalry. And what followed in that coconut grove was not a battle. It was the end of a battle. Japanese soldiers who had survived the night found themselves trapped. Some tried to swim to safety and were shot in the water. Some charged with bayonets when their ammunition was gone. Some sat down and killed themselves rather than be captured. The tanks rolled through the coconut palms, their treads doing what tanks do when there is no more resistance and no more mercy. Colonel Clifton Cates, who had fought in France in the trenches of the First World War, walked through the aftermath. He wrote later that he had never seen such a congestion of dead as he did that day on the sandspit and in the coconut grove. Of 917 Japanese soldiers who had crossed the water with Colonel Ichiki, roughly 813 were dead by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 14 Japanese, 12 of them wounded, were taken prisoner. The Marines had lost 42 killed and 71 wounded. For every American who fell, more than 18 Japanese soldiers had died. Ichiki himself burned his regimental colors, an act of profound disgrace in the Japanese military tradition. He did not survive the day. Whether he was killed in the final fighting or whether he took his own life, the accounts have never fully agreed. What is certain is that he did not live to explain what had happened. Somewhere on that killing ground, a doctrine that had guided a generation of Japanese officers began quietly to bleed out. But in Tokyo, the doctrine was not dying. It was being denied. When the reports of the Tenaru reached Imperial General Headquarters, the reaction was not reassessment. The reaction was disbelief. A Japanese infantry regiment could not have been annihilated by American Marines. That was not a thing that could happen. That was not a thing the world was allowed to contain. The reports must be wrong. The casualty numbers must be exaggerated. Ichiki must have attacked the wrong position. Something must have failed in the execution. The Americans, whatever they had done, had not truly done it. There was some other explanation. This was more than pride. This was the deep architecture of Japanese military culture. Officers who admitted failure risked disgrace not only to themselves, but to the men above them. The men who had chosen them, the men whose careers and honor were joined to their own. A colonel could not have simply been beaten by inferior enemies. It was easier and safer to reach for another answer. The answer they reached for was numbers. Ichiki had sent 900 men. 900, they concluded, was not enough. Send more. The next man given the honor of retaking Guadalcanal was Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. He was around 49 years old, a veteran of successful campaigns in Borneo and the Philippines. He was, by the standards of the Imperial Army, a thoughtful commander. He was known to care about his men. He was known to think before he moved. He read the reports from the Tenaru carefully. He understood, in a way Ichiki had not lived to understand, that a frontal charge across an open sandbar was not going to work. The Marines were better prepared than expected. The plan needed to be smarter. His plan was smarter. That is what makes what happened to him more important, not less. Kawaguchi would land nearly 6,000 men on Guadalcanal. He would march them through the jungle. He would not attack where the Marines expected him. He would come at them from the south. Through the hills, where the perimeter was thinner, there was a ridge running down toward Henderson Field that offered a natural avenue of attack. If he could take that ridge in a night assault, he could pour his men through the breach and be on the airfield before the Americans could organize. The ridge in September 1942 had no name. Within a week, it would have two. The Americans would call it Edson's Ridge. History would call it Bloody Ridge. Kawaguchi's approach march was a slow catastrophe. The jungle was worse than the maps had promised. Trails vanished. Streams appeared where they should not have been. Units became separated in the dark green tangle. Radio contact failed. Men who had been strong at the beach were weak by the time they reached the base of the ridge. Their supplies had not come with them. Some of them had eaten nothing in a day, some in 2. He kept going. He believed that spirit would still be enough. Waiting for him on that ridge were about 800 Marines. They were among the best trained men in the entire Corps. They belonged to the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion. They were commanded by a lieutenant colonel named Merritt Edson. Edson was 45 years old. He had red hair and a quiet voice. His men called him Red Mike behind his back and to his face. He had fought Sandino's guerrillas in the mountains of Nicaragua. He had a reputation for asking his men to do things no sane commander would ask, and then doing those things with them. He had positioned his defenders carefully along the ridge. He had walked the ground. He had chosen where the machine guns would be. He had pre-registered the artillery. He knew, though he could not have said how, that something was coming for the ridge. On the night of September 12, 1942, it came. The Japanese attacked in waves, screaming their battle cries into a jungle lit by flares. The first shock hit Edson's line and pushed it back. The second shock pushed it back further. There was a moment in the darkness when Japanese soldiers were inside the American positions. There was a moment when the airfield itself, the entire reason any of them were on this island, was within reach of Kawaguchi's leading companies. Marines fell back to their final line. If that line broke, Henderson Field would be lost. If Henderson Field was lost, the campaign was lost. If the campaign was lost, the Pacific War would look very different in the morning. Merritt Edson walked along that final line under fire. He did not crouch. He did not hide. He moved from position to position with his hands empty and his voice steady. Marines who had been about to break saw him standing where the bullets were, and they stopped breaking. He gathered a group of men who were, by any honest measure, at the end of what men can give. He did not shout. He did not curse. According to the official accounts, he told them the truth. They had done a great job, he said. He had one more thing to ask of them. Hold out just one more night. He knew they had been without sleep, but another attack was coming. Hold this ridge. They held it. The artillery began to fall exactly where it had been asked to fall. Kawaguchi's assault waves broke apart in the shells. The coordination between the infantry on the ridge and the gunners in the rear was the kind of coordination that comes from long training and long trust, and it did what it was built to do. When Japanese soldiers reached the American lines, they were met with grenades and bayonets and the flat sound of Springfield rifles at close range. By the morning of September 14, Kawaguchi's offensive was finished. More than 600 of his men were dead on the ridge and in the jungle around it. The survivors began a nightmare retreat westward, a march that would kill hundreds more from hunger and disease. Vandegrift, years later, would say something quiet about that night. He would say it was the only time in the entire campaign that he had truly doubted the outcome. If Kawaguchi had broken through, he admitted, we would have been in a pretty bad condition. The historian, Richard B. Frank would write, years later, that the Japanese had never come closer to victory on Guadalcanal than in September 1942. On a ridge just south of the critical airfield, best known ever after as Bloody Ridge, Kawaguchi's men had come very close. They had not come close enough. In Rabaul, the pattern repeated: denial, blame, and a decision to send more. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hakutake, commander of the 17th Army, would come to Guadalcanal himself. He was 54 years old, and he would bring with him more than 20,000 men. The 2nd Division, the Sendai, one of the most illustrious units in the entire Imperial Japanese Army. They were veterans of Manchuria. They were veterans of China. They had never been beaten. The plan for October was not clever. It did not need to be. It was overwhelming. Multiple attacks would strike the marine perimeter from different directions. Naval bombardment would soften the airfield. Air attacks would suppress American aviation. The weight of numbers, the weight of steel, and the weight of Yamato spirit would finally be enough. Hayakutake's staff was so confident that they drafted plans for the surrender ceremony. They discussed the details. They wanted it to be the envy of every unit in the Army. They wanted it to be beautiful. Hayakutake sent a message to Tokyo before the attack began. The time of the decisive battle between Japan and the United States has come. He was right about that. He was wrong about who would win it. On the night of October 24, 1942, the main Japanese assault came out of the jungle south of Henderson Field. And along one particular stretch of that line, behind 2 positions of heavy machine guns, was a 25-year-old sergeant named John Basilone. He had been born in Buffalo, New York, and raised in Raritan, New Jersey. He was the 6th of 10 children in an Italian-American family. Before he was a Marine, he had been a soldier, and he had served with the United States Army in the Philippines. That was where the nickname came from, Manila John. He knew the .30 caliber machine gun the way a musician knows an instrument. He had been called one of the finest gunners in the Corps. That night, 3,000 men of the Sendai Division came at his sector. The fight lasted through the darkness and into the next day. It lasted longer than any single fight should last. Basilone did not sleep. He did not eat. When his ammunition ran low, he went to get more. He crossed 200 yards of ground that was being swept by Japanese fire, and he came back carrying 90 pounds of weapons and ammunition on his shoulders. When his gun crews were killed or wounded, he moved from position to position and worked the guns himself. When the barrels overheated and the weapons jammed, he stripped them and cleared them with his bare hands. The steel burned him. He kept working. The Japanese kept coming, and in front of his position they kept dying. The bodies piled up. They piled up so high in a wall of the dead that they blocked the field of fire. Marines had to leave their holes and go out in front of the guns and push the corpses aside so that they could keep shooting. There is a description of Barcelona that night given later by another Marine, a private first class named Nash Phillips, who had lost a hand in the fight. Barcelona came to see him at the medical station. Phillips remembered him this way, barefoot, eyes red as fire, face black with gunpowder and no sleep, sleeves rolled up over his shoulders, a .45 pistol shoved into the waistband of his trousers. He had just come by, Phillips said, to see how his men were making out. I will never forget him, Phillips said. He will never be dead in my mind. When reinforcements finally arrived at his section of the line, only Barcelona and 2 other Marines were still standing. The ground in front of them was carpeted with Japanese dead. He would receive the Medal of Honor. He would become the first enlisted Marine of the Second World War to earn it. The rest of Hyakutake's offensive broke apart in the same way. Along the Matanikau River, Japanese tanks came out of the darkness and were killed one by Marines with 37mm guns. In sector after sector, the Sendai Division ran into fire that did not stop and lines that did not break. When the fighting ended, somewhere between 2,200 and 3,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Fewer than 100 Marines had been killed. The surrender ceremony that Hyakutake's staff had planned so carefully was never held. After the battle, a Marine officer named Louis Puller was interrogating a Japanese prisoner. Puller was 44 years old, the commander of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. His men called him Chesty for the way he carried himself. He would eventually become the most decorated Marine in the history of the Corps. That day, he was asking a simple question. He asked the prisoner why the Japanese had not changed their tactics when they saw they were not breaking the American line. Why had they not shifted their attacks to a weaker sector? Why had they kept coming, wave after wave, into the same guns? The prisoner's answer would explain, in one sentence, why Japan was going to lose this island. That is not the Japanese way. The plan had been made. No one would have dared to change it. It must go as it is written. Puller listened to the translation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he understood something that Imperial General Headquarters had not yet allowed itself to understand. The Marines were not winning because they were braver. The Marines were not winning because they had better weapons. The Marines were winning because their enemy had built an army that could not think while it was fighting, and their own commanders had built men who could. Somewhere in Tokyo, generals were still drafting orders that said the Americans would break at the next attack. Somewhere on a jungle island, the men who were supposed to break were digging in for the next one and the one after that. And the war that Japan believed it was fighting was no longer the war that was happening. By the end of 1942, the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal had a new name for the place. They did not call it Guadalcanal anymore. They called it Gato, the Starvation Island. The men who had been sent to retake it from the Americans were no longer thinking about retaking it. They were thinking about food. They were thinking about water. They were thinking about the strange, distant feeling in their own limbs, the feeling of a body beginning to consume itself. The Tokyo Express, the nightly runs of Japanese destroyers down the long channel the Americans called the Slot, still tried to bring in supplies, but American aircraft flew from Henderson Field now. American aircraft flew from an airfield the Japanese had built and then failed 3 times to take back. During the day, no slow transport ship could survive those waters. Everything had to be run in at night on fast warships that could not stay long. The destroyers would push barrels of rice and cans of food off their decks into the surf, hoping the current would carry them to the beach. The current did not always cooperate. The barrels drifted out to sea. Starving men waded into the water and watched their food float away in the moonlight. They ate roots. They ate the bark of trees. They ate grass. They developed malaria. They developed dysentery. They developed beriberi, the disease of the vitamin-starved, which made their legs swell and their hearts weaken. Men who had marched into the jungle as veterans of Manchuria became, in a matter of weeks, walking skeletons who could no longer carry a rifle. Among themselves, in the silent way that soldiers pass hard truths to one another, they developed a chart. It was not written down. It did not need to be. It was passed from one hollow-eyed man to another around the ashes of fires that had nothing left to cook. A man who could still stand had 30 days to live. A man who could sit up had 3 weeks. A man who could no longer sit up had 1 week. A man who had to urinate lying down had 3 days. A man who could no longer speak had 2 days. A man who could no longer blink his eyes would be dead by morning. They watched American aircraft cross overhead in formations. They watched American supply ships approach the beaches they had failed to take. They heard American artillery in the distance. And they understood, in a way that no order from Tokyo could reach, that everything their commanders had told them about the enemy had been a lie. The lie was not only killing them on the island. It was reaching quietly and terribly into the highest rooms of the Japanese military. In late December of 1942, Lieutenant General Hyakutake, the man who had come to Guadalcanal to oversee the final victory, sent a message to Tokyo. No food available. We can no longer send out scouts. We can do nothing to withstand the enemy's offensive. He asked, in the terrible formal language of his profession, for permission to lead his remaining men in a final charge, not to win, to die. The request went up the chain. It reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was 58 years old. He was the commander of the combined fleet. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor, and he was one of the very few senior Japanese officers who had ever tried to warn his own government about the United States. He had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had walked through American factories and watched American industry and understood, in a way most Japanese planners refused to understand, what he was looking at. Before the war, he had said something that would follow him for the rest of his life. He had said that in the first 6 months to a year of a war with the United States, he could run wild and win victory upon victory. But after that, he had said he had no expectation of success. Now, at the end of 1942, he sat down and wrote to Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa about the situation on Guadalcanal. The comparison he reached for was not a comparison from the current war. It was older. It went back to the war that had made Japan a great power in the first place. He wrote that the situation on Guadalcanal was very serious. And then he wrote that it was more serious than what Japan had faced at Port Arthur in 1904 and 1905, when the survival of the empire had hung on a single fortress against the Russian Baltic Fleet. For a Japanese admiral, that comparison was not a phrase. It was a confession. It was a man of great intelligence saying quietly into a private letter that the war his country had chosen to start was already lost. The evacuation was called Operation Key. It began on the last night of January 1943 and ran through the first days of February. Over 3 nights, Japanese destroyers came in fast, took on as many men as they could, and left before dawn. They stripped the island of roughly 10,600 survivors, sliding them out from under the noses of an American command that did not, until it was over, understand that a withdrawal was happening. The Americans expected another attack. What they got instead was silence. The men left behind on the island did not leave, not living and not dead. The numbers, when they were finally counted, told a story no Japanese planner had prepared for. Of the nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers who died on Guadalcanal, fewer than 9,000 had been killed by American guns. The rest, more than 20,000 of them, had simply wasted away. Killed not by Marines, killed by malaria, killed by dysentery, killed by starvation so complete that they could no longer stand, and then could no longer sit, and then could no longer blink. For every American who died on the island, close to 10 Japanese soldiers had died. And most of those Japanese had not died fighting. They had died forgotten. And the survivors, the ones the destroyers had carried away, were survivors only in a technical sense. Many of them were broken. Many carried diseases that would never fully leave their bodies. Many would spend the rest of their lives dreaming about the jungle. Guadalcanal had not been a defeat. It had been a hemorrhage. After the war, when the shooting was over and the empire was gone, historians went to the surviving Japanese commanders. They asked them about the campaign. They asked what it had meant. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, the man who had failed on Bloody Ridge, gave them a sentence that would follow the battle for the rest of history. Guadalcanal, he said, is the graveyard of the Japanese army. He was not exaggerating. The Sendai Division, one of the oldest and proudest formations in the Imperial Army, had been shattered. The Ichiki detachment had ceased to exist. The Kawaguchi Brigade had been ground down into remnants. The naval pilots who had died in the air battles over the island were, in almost every case, veterans who could not be replaced. Japanese naval aviation, the striking arm that had won at Pearl Harbor and lost at Midway, had suffered another wound at Guadalcanal, and it was a wound that would never heal. But the deepest loss was not measured in divisions or ships or pilots. The deepest loss was invisible. It was the death of belief. For two generations, Japanese officers had built their war plans on one assumption: Yamato spirit. They believed it would carry Japanese soldiers through any material disadvantage. That belief had guided their doctrine. It had shaped their training. It had persuaded their planners that a war with the United States was winnable in the first place. On Guadalcanal, the belief had met the United States Marine Corps, and the belief had lost. The men who had listened, the men who had been paying attention, carried the lesson forward. And in the last terrible battles of the Pacific War, you can see the shape of that lesson in the way they fought. On the island of Peleliu in September 1944, a colonel named Kunio Nakagawa did something that no earlier Japanese commander would have imagined. He did not launch a banzai charge. He did not throw his men into the American guns and pray for spirit to be enough. He put them underground. He built a defense in caves and tunnels. He made the Marines pay for every meter, and he made them pay with time and blood and shells. He had understood at last what the men on Guadalcanal had refused to understand. You could not break these Americans with a scream and a bayonet. On the island of Iwo Jima in early 1945, a lieutenant general named Tadamichi Kuribayashi did the same thing on a larger scale. He was the man from the beginning of this story. The man who had studied in the United States. The man who had ridden with the U.S. cavalry at Fort Bliss. The man who had told his family again and again that America was the last country in the world Japan should fight. He forbade banzai charges on Iwo Jima. He forbade the last desperate rush that had killed so many of his countrymen for so little. Instead, he built 18 kilometers of tunnels through volcanic rock. He hid his defenders inside the mountain, and when the Marines came ashore, he made them fight for every step. The battle for Iwo Jima would be the only battle of the Pacific War in which American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. Kuribayashi did that. And he did it because he had watched, from a great distance, what had happened on Guadalcanal, and he had drawn the lesson that Ichiki had died, refusing to draw. On the island of Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, a colonel on the Japanese staff named Hiromichi Yahara argued against launching a general counterattack. He argued for a deep, patient, layered defense. He argued for making the Americans bleed slowly rather than dying quickly. He was overruled, and the counterattack was launched, and it failed, and Yahara lived to write a book about it after the war. In that book, he wrote about the respect that Japanese officers had come to feel for the American Marines. It was not affection. It was not admiration in the sentimental sense. It was the respect that professional soldiers give to other professional soldiers who have proven themselves in the only classroom that counts. That respect was the true legacy of Guadalcanal. It was written in the tunnels of Peleliu. It was carved into the volcanic stone of Iwo Jima. It was buried in the strategy papers of Okinawa. And every Japanese commander who wrote it there was writing, whether he knew it or not, a footnote to a battle fought 2 years earlier by a division of Marines who had been given 3 weeks of training and told to hold an airfield. The men who had held that airfield went on to their own destinies. Alexander Vandegrift received the Medal of Honor. He would rise to become the 18th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps and the first Marine ever to hold 4-star rank on active duty. He had done what he had been asked to do. He had held. Merit Edson received the Medal of Honor for the ridge that would forever bear his name. The ground where he stood in the open under fire and told his men to hold out one more night is still called Edson's Ridge on the maps. Jacob Vuza, the coast watcher who had been bayoneted 7 times and had crawled through the jungle to warn the Marines, survived his wounds. He became an honorary sergeant major in the United States Marine Corps. He lived a long life. He died in March of 1984 at the age of 91. In the Solomon Islands, they remember him still. John Basilone, the sergeant from Raritan who had held his line against 3,000 men of the Sendai Division, went home. He was offered a commission. He was offered a stateside job selling war bonds. He turned both offers down. He asked to go back. On February 19, 1945, he stepped off a landing craft onto the black sand of Iwo Jima. On that first day of the invasion, he single-handedly destroyed a Japanese blockhouse. Then he began to guide a tank through a minefield under heavy fire. He was killed there in the volcanic ash at the age of 28. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. He remains the only enlisted Marine of the entire Second World War to have received both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He was 28 years old, a boy from Raritan, New Jersey, a machine gunner, a Marine. If you have ever driven past Arlington, you have driven past him. If your father served in the Pacific, he may have known a Basilone in his own unit. The names change. The story does not. The 1st Marine Division, so ravaged by combat and disease that it had to be pulled out of the Pacific for months of recovery, came back. It fought at Cape Gloucester. It fought at Peleliu. It fought at Okinawa. And on its shoulder patch, to this day, in a red numeral 1 on a blue diamond beneath the stars of the Southern Cross, is a single word: Guadalcanal. Every Marine who has worn that patch since 1943 has worn it because of what was done on that island. There is a temptation, when the story is told, to make it larger than it was. To say that the Marines won because of some special quality, some invisible fire, that is not what happened. That is not the honest answer. And the men who were there would be the first to tell you it is not. The Marines did not win because they had better weapons. In many cases, their weapons were worse. The Japanese Zero was more maneuverable than the American planes it fought. The Japanese Long Lance torpedo was more reliable than anything the U.S. Navy carried. Japanese night fighting doctrine was, at the start of the war, superior to anything the Americans could match. The Marines did not win because they were more numerous. Ichiki attacked with 900 men against 11,000. But on Bloody Ridge, and again in October, the sides were closer to even, and it was the Japanese who came in with the advantage in men. The Marines did not win because they had overwhelming supplies. Their food was captured Japanese rice. Their positions were held on rationed artillery shells. Their medical supplies ran out. They were, for weeks at a time, the loneliest fighting men in the Pacific. They won because they fought. They won because they had been trained by men who had thought hard about how to fight this war and had built a doctrine and a culture that let sergeants make decisions and corporals hold ground when their officers were down. They won because they refused to break in a place where the doctrine said they should break, and they won in the end because their enemy had been taught something that was not true about them, and they were given the chance, over 6 months of jungle and hunger and dying, to teach him the truth. Today, the battlefields on Guadalcanal are quiet. The jungle has come back over the foxholes. The wire has rusted into the soil. Farmers plowing their fields still, from time to time, turn up a helmet or a canteen or a bone. A rusted helmet. A canteen with a bullet hole. The bones of a young man from Osaka or from Ohio that no one will ever be able to name. The ridge that Merit Edson held is a peaceful place now. Grass grows on the crest. Small flowers grow where the Sendai Division died. In the American Marine Corps, Guadalcanal is remembered as a beginning. It is the ground on which the modern Corps was made. Every Marine who has served since the summer of 1942 has served in the long shadow of what those men did there. Alone, on an island most of their countrymen could not find on a map. In Japan, the memory is quieter and heavier. The men who studied the war after it was over, the surviving generals and staff officers and historians, understood what had happened on Guadalcanal even when their government preferred not to. They knew where the turning point had been. They knew where the myth had died. Kuribayashi knew it in his cave on Iwo Jima, writing his last letters home. Yahara knew it in his strategy papers on Okinawa. Kawaguchi knew it in the sentence he gave to historians after the war, the graveyard of the Japanese army. And Yamamoto knew it in the private letter he wrote from Rabaul, comparing the American Marines on a jungle island to the great siege of Port Arthur from the war of his youth. He had told his own government before the shooting started that he could give them 6 months. 6 months of victories, and then he had said there would be nothing. On Guadalcanal, the 6 months ended. The men who ended them were young. Many of them had been civilians a year before. They had gone into the recruiting stations after Pearl Harbor with anger in their chests and almost nothing in the way of training. They had been sent to an island they could not have described. They had been abandoned by their own fleet. They had been sick, hungry, outnumbered at times, and always alone. And they had done, without knowing they were doing it, the one thing that decided the Pacific War. They had proven that the men on the other side of the line had been wrong about them from the beginning. Everything that came after Guadalcanal, every island, every landing, every long walk up a beach into the guns, all of it grew from what those Marines did on that jungle-covered island in the fall of 1942. They were sons, they were brothers. Most of them were younger than the grandchildren we have today. They held the ridge, and then they came home, and then they did not talk about it. They did not know they were changing history. They were just trying to hold the ridge.